Welcome to Writer, a program for and about writers sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm Mary Sue Koeppel, your host, and with me today is Shelley Mickle. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Shelley is the author of 2 books, one of them The Queen of October and the other one Replacing Dad, 2 novels. And besides that, you have written several plays.
Right.
One acts.
Right, one act.
And you just told me that both of your books, your novels, have been picked up. Would you start by impressing us about that?
Well, it happens to a lot of novelists, but it is very nice to know that we're entering an electronic age now where books, the literate age, is moving into more of the electronic and visual, and there's a blending happening, and both of my books have been optioned by a movie production company, one possibly for producing on TV and one for movies. It happens to a lot of writers, and it's exciting. It's nice to have other people read your work with that in mind, bringing it to the screen.
And I asked you how it happened, and you said they picked it off the shelf.
Well, someone picked it off the shelf in a bookstore, read it, and sent it to a producer, and that producer got other producers involved, and then they all start reaching in their pockets to see who can afford to show it around anymore. But it says a lot, I think, about the age that we're living in now, and that I think books and cinema, film are going to be blending, and music and computers.
Well, I wouldn't put myself down. I mean, that's a great compliment to you, Shelley, a great, great compliment. We're here today to talk about you because you're a comedy writer. What does that mean to you when people call you a comedy writer?
Well, my books have been reviewed and described occasionally, or I guess most often, as domestic comedies. I write about the fragmented family. I believe that a writer's job is writing the stories that are being lived around her in her own time and place. And I think the one that we're seeing most prevalently now is the changes within the family. The other thing that I do that gives me a lot of opportunities to use comedy in my work is that I create children's voices. I think I'm one of the few adult writers who are actually creating adult voices for adult readers. And for that reason, my books are being read now in several high schools and are beginning to be included on curriculum in some, not just on selective reading lists. And those reviews that I get from kids are really quite wonderful. I had a little boy call me up. He's about a 10th grader. And he called me up like at 11 o'clock at night, and he said, "Can you be at school tomorrow at 8 o'clock, and can I interview you in front of everybody?" As though that would help him, get this book report over with. And I said, "Well, that's pretty short notice, And he said, "Well, I'm really desperate. Do you have any cliff notes?" So when he asked me for that, I don't know, that may be a signal I've arrived within a certain set.
Absolutely, cliff notes. When you say that you're part of the curriculum for these young kids, does that mean like high schools are adopting you as part of their literature program, or?
Okay, yes, several high schools in my town and some in Virginia. The kids have been writing me letters and trying to get me to help them with some of their reports.
Well, my favorite character in Replacing Dad was that little George II.
Oh, yeah.
How old was he? 4?
4.
Kept walking around and calling everything a fart. Because and it really made me believe that you had some real talent for being able to tell us what these little kids say. They don't make a lot of sense, but they're certainly cute and fun. But they do make sense. I didn't mean to say that they don't, but they make their own kind of sense. When you say that you are writing comedy, I'm supposing that you're teaching comedy as well, and you go back to the history of comedy, what does comedy mean to you as opposed to tragedy or opposed to romance or other kinds of writing?
I think it's a vision and a viewpoint. I think comedy is very, very powerful. Dorothy Parker said, "No writer is complete without it." And when I discovered my own comic voice or my own humorous voice, I know that my work took an enormous leap. It's more or less a vision of looking at the chaotic side of life, which we all discover, which we all live day to day, every day, and I think it has a lot to do with the ability to portray. It can be a weapon at times. I've used it as a weapon. I've used it as a means of diffusing situations within families, within people, and it just seems to be a natural flair once you develop the vision for seeing the opportunities to use it.
How would you describe what you're doing in a novel when you make it comedy? I mean, are you using slapstick? Are you using verbal wordplay? What are you doing?
I more or less do all of it in different places, particularly with the kids and replacing Dad. There's a good bit of slapstick. There's a 15-year-old boy, Drew, in replacing Dad, who has just gotten his learner's permit. And there's an emergency in the family. He has to drive the car to pick up another child who's in trouble, and the mother is at work, and he doesn't want her to know about it because he's afraid she'll flip out. So she's in the process of learning how to teach CPR around the town. She has the CPR doll named Annie. So Drew puts the CPR doll in the front seat and passes her off as his driver, his adult driver. So I would call that slapstick. And then there are other opportunities, other ways of these characters looking at their life that is just mainly humorous.
Well, it was obvious to me as I was reading this that this would make a great TV series. I mean, each one of these is a quirky character who's having a great deal of fun, I suspect, in your mind when you're writing them, and certainly in the minds of the readers. When you do this kind of writing, are you visualizing actual scenes?
Oh, yeah, very definitely. The wonderful thing, I mean, I would say that most of my novels are bittersweet. They're not just hilarious romps. There's always an undercut there with very deep sorrow. But that's one of the uses of humor, is to handle anger, to handle sorrow. And yes, I think that it comes around in all the characters. I see them doing these things and mainly have fun with them. And when you're having fun writing it, it shows.
Would you talk a little bit about what you mean when you say that comedy is a way of handling anger? Probably many people respond to that. And then you say comedy is a way of handling sorrow. Probably that is less understandable or less
The fact that you can use humor to look at sorrow, to handle sorrow in your life. Well, I think that once a humorous viewpoint is developed, you can almost take any event in any life, and there are two sides or more, many sides to it. And of course, there's always the tragic, and you look at it that way. I often say in my classes as an exercise to pretend that you've gone to the grocery store, you're driving to the grocery store, and you just discovered there's a bee in the car with you. Write it tragically one time, and the second time write it humorously. So that exercise alone probably tells you, I mean, it's a tragedy when you get the bee in there. But then when he puts you through all those antics of getting him out, there's probably some point where most of us, for our own mental health, start laughing and see ourselves as the victim of this very small bee.
Can everything be treated humorously?
I think almost everything. I mean, a good example is Vonnegut, who has handled war in that horrible way. Mark Twain, who's a great idol of mine. I think it's time we had a female Mark Twain. I think that, yeah, there are just many opportunities that we can diffuse almost any situation by looking at it, and not mean-spirited, but the fact of the human spirit trying to come to terms with the chaos in our lives and the evil. Some things are very dark, but I think most times there's at least a flicker of, it's for our own sanity, I think, you know.
Replacing Dad is talking about the sorrow of losing your father in your house, losing your wife, your husband.
Right. It's the loss of the family. That's what both of my novels so far have been driven by grief, the emotion of grief. And this family in particular is grieving over what's happened to them. And so many of my own friends were living that story that I think that's where the inspiration came to write it, because I was hearing this story over and over. And I more or less developed my own characters that could represent some of the emotional needs and conflicts that these families were having. For instance, one of the stories that I heard that touched me very deeply was that a particular son of a divorced mother at night had trouble sleeping because he felt responsible for the family's safety.
And you write that.
And I include that in my book. But I think very few of us understand, because boys don't maybe talk about their feelings quite as much, of maybe some of the stresses that young boys go through. And of course, because I'm raising a son, and raising a son is helping me understand all men, I think. But not until I've raised one would I even claim to come close to understanding them. But I think that hearing that story was particularly poignant to me because it made me understand a little bit more about that particular situation of a young man losing his father, not losing him from his life, but losing him from his house and how that affects him.
You're drawing on then the things that have happened to your friends. You said you had a son.
Right.
Where do your other characters come from? Do you have children besides one son?
Yes, well, I'll tell you this story, which
Okay.
I took writing classes at every place that would let me in, and one of them was at Harvard, and I took classes there in the Harvard Night School, and one of the professors sat me down one day, and he said, you know, I think you're probably good enough to take yourself seriously, and for that reason I would advise you not to have any children. And I knew where he was coming from because most of the good novelists, Virginia Woolf, George Eliot, Jane Austen, on down the line, Ann Beatty, Joyce Carol Oates in this country, the Southerners, Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty, have been women without children. So I was fairly enraged by that, and I guess I took it on a dare, although I did plan to have children, but I had two. And I felt that it was time perhaps when somebody, if not me, and there is a whole generation now of my age and younger, who have chosen not to make that choice.
Not to have children.
No, they do have children. They've chosen not to follow the model. And I think the reason that we're able to is the computer, actually, because we can do 12 hours of work in 6. And so there are plenty of mothers now who are writing, and I think that we're going to begin to see a new type of literature that's not going to be what they call women's fluff. I mean, it's not going to be in women's magazines, but it's going to be women's lives. Virginia Woolf said that women wouldn't really begin to feel their capabilities until the year 2029, that we would have confidence in our own voices. And so I feel like, you know, we're getting ready to hit the 2029 pretty soon. I think I can hear the computers kind of warming up, but I think there are a lot of mothers who are going to have real children in their literature.
Well, don't you think that you have confidence in your voice? I mean, I'm hearing that.
I do, yeah. At my age and time, if I don't, I'm in trouble. But someone asked me one time, because I am from Memphis and was raised in Arkansas and Tennessee, they said, do you consider yourself a Southern writer? And I said, with this accent, what else could I be? So, yes, I think very definitely my voice has been established in these two books. And, of course, the thing that I do is write all my books in the first person because I like to get as close as possible to the characters.
And in this one, you have the I character of the mother, Linda, and the I character of the, what, 15, 16-year-old,
Yes.
Drew?
I have alternating chapters.
Yeah, that's a good technique, and it seems because you're giving both the adult perspective and then the kid's perspective, but you're talking about the grief of the family, so in one sense, we get it from all the areas. And I would suspect that when little kids are studying this in high school, they're not little kids, sorry.
Right.
When kids are studying this in high school, they're thinking about their little brothers and sisters and the effects on them, and they're also thinking about it from the effects on their mother. I think it was a good choice. Are you happy with that choice of narrators?
It was fun to do. It really was. It kept the story interesting to me. It gave me a challenge because I had to work at keeping each of the tellers' voices' styles different. And that was a challenge as a writer. I wanted to have that challenge. Like, for instance, Drew is the one who uses all the curse words and the mother doesn't. So there are little things like that that I sort of made rules for myself, but I tried to make their voices as distinctive as possible.
Can we go back to something that you said earlier about women's voices and women's literature and women's fluff? What do you mean?
Women's fluff? I think that the women's magazines have shortchanged women for
By
a very
women's
long time.
magazines, you mean?
Well, I hate to name names, but
But,
the ones
I
that
mean-
teach us that we like to clean
Oh, good.
and cook.
Oh, good.
That's what I mean. The magazines that for years have had all the advertisements for cleaning aids been shown by a woman, as though we really love doing that. And all the stories have been to indulge a romantic viewpoint, a romantic outlook. And I think women have not had enough confidence to realize that their own stories are not boring. And I didn't realize that until I realized that Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary were two of the greatest stories in world literature, and they're women's stories. And men wrote them, and they weren't bored. So when I started realizing that in our everyday lives there were stories that yet have to be told, that it's important to do
Well, I'm
them.
real interested in your answer because I'm the editor of a women's journal, but that's a literary journal that I'm dealing with. And one of the things that has happened is that we are dealing with the writer, the emerging writer, and the sophisticated, well-accepted writer at the same time, trying to give women who are new mentors, trying to give women who have some possibility of becoming fine writers a place to get published. Because if you know how hard it is to break in, and FSCJ puts out this fantastically wonderful journal called Calliope, a Journal of Women's Art.
That's important.
Yeah, it is. Let me just go back a minute. When you talk about fluff, you're talking then about the oven cleaners, right? You're not talking about
And
the
this-
women who are trying to discover what they have to say.
And the women who promoting the view that women are waiting for the prince on the white horse to come
Yeah.
rescue them.
What I found interesting, though, in replacing Dad, it seemed to end like a romance. Because 5 pages from the end, she had this horrendous shall I or shall I not experience, and then at the end, all things work out for the best. Is that what a comedy does? It has a happy ending?
Well, most comedies end from the time of the Greeks with a wedding. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to show how it is possible for people to heal and to have enough courage to try again. And this is a love story in that sense, but it also has to deal with how they plan to deal with their fear that it would happen again, because they knew that it was. It was not a romantic ending in the sense that they thought everything was going to work out hunky-dory. They knew that they were carrying with them a lot of baggage and a lot of fears, but they were ready to try it. So that was more or less my point. But the classic structure of a comedy is usually to bring all the cast together in a wedding.
I asked you if you would please pick out a little section that you would mind reading to us so that the listeners could get a little feel for what you write. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is to perhaps share some hints so that emerging writers or new writers could learn a little bit about comedy from you.
This is told in Drew's voice. He's 15, remember. My family was driving me nuts, totally out of my tree. Mandy was still having all these allergy attacks, getting so she couldn't breathe because of something she was wearing, she said. Mom had taken her in to see Dr. Haley, and he had put her on some kind of medicine and had given her this little inhaler that she walked around with, and she could stick it in her mouth at any given minute and breathe like Darth Vader. Meanwhile, Mom was sending all sorts of Mandy's stuff down to the Salvation Army. Pink sweaters, her yellow house shoes, a skirt with red dots on it that Annie Marie had bought for her. So ugly it would have made me stop breathing, too. And George had taken up with his Halloween costume like he had the word fart. Wouldn't take it off come hell or high water. He was walking around in his rabbit suit every day now. I was hoping Mandy would get allergic to it. But even worse than his rabbit suit was that he'd started carrying a purse. He got one of those old ones that Mom had given to Mandy, and he filled it up with stuff that was usually in Mom's: lifesavers, loose change, old notes, a set of keys. I kept telling him it just didn't go together, a rabbit and a purse. But as usual with George, making sense didn't mean anything. I thought sure Dad would talk him out of the purse when we all went out to dinner on the nights Dad stopped by. But instead, Dad just tolerated George in his rabbit suit and the purse and wasn't bothered by any of it. I heard him whisper to his new wife, Anne Marie, that George was just working out his emotions about women and men and it'd blow over. Now, I don't know what in the hell that meant, because it seemed to me the little bit of psychology my dad got before he became principal of the school just ruined him. Of course, he didn't have to live with George now. He didn't have to spend more than a couple of hours a week with a sexually confused rabbit. It was me who had to appear most often with George in public. It was me. My advice to beginning writers is to have fun and to search for your own voice and don't let anyone deter you from finding it or putting another one on you. You have to find your own.
You know, you and I could have a huge discussion about voice. I used to do so much with my own students about finding your own voice, finding your own voice. And then I went to work with a major writer who I'd never been to a workshop before in my life. And she said, all the stuff about finding your voice is nonsense. Absolutely nonsense. How could you find your voice? We all have a voice. We all have to use our voice. That's all there is. You only have your voice. What would you have said to her?
Well, I think all of us as beginning apprentices imitate. That's how we learn. I know when I was in college, I did a very stupid thing, but it was a form of therapy. I would take Proust, Remembrance of Things Past, and just copy long pages, notebooks full, because his sentences were so beautiful. And I think in different periods of our lives, we imitate or we're attracted to different sorts of styles. And I think until we mature enough in our personality to have confidence in the way that we look at the world, which is where we get our own images, our metaphors and similes should be ours. And yet when we're a little bit anxious that they're not good enough, we'll choose someone else's and don't even know we're choosing them. But we lean on those that have already been accepted. And I think that's just natural and normal. And so finding your own voice is more or less a part of finding your own personality and having enough confidence to show it. I know a lot of writing classes that I had, I found myself imitating the teacher because I figured he liked his own stuff. And it would get you some good grades or some attention, but
Did it?
most times, yes.
Yeah, I think
but it takes a while to pull back from that and begin to write in some isolation. Or one of the things that I do as a teacher is never to read very much of my own stuff for that reason, because I feel the students parroting me a little bit, and that's not my job as a teacher.
You said that you were going to teach people how to be critics of each other, how to ask the question so as not to put each other down, but to elicit the better writing.
Right.
Could you talk about that a bit?
One of the first things that, what I do in the classes that I teach is set a moral tone. I think moralistically I need to do this, is set a tone of how we will approach each other's work. And I suggest that we do two things, and we each have a piece of paper when we listen to each other's work. So we are actually writing, and we're not just sitting there as though we're intimidating the person who's reading. And we have to do two things. And the first thing is to write down one thing that you will remember when that person finishes reading it. For instance, if you went home and thought about that piece, what one thing would jump in your mind? That helps that writer find his own voice. He hit a spot there that is different, that was original, that was fresh. And then the second thing we have to do, number two, is ask a question, any question. And that stimulates the writer's imagination. And it also can point out places where the story is not logical. That's what any good editor does for a writer, is to make sure that in chapter 1 you get in a blue car, then in chapter 2 you're still in a blue car and you haven't switched to red. Because writing a novel or a long story is a whole lot like making a quilt or patting your stomach and rubbing your head at the same time. And that's an editor's job, is to keep all those little things together. But when you do ask the writer questions about his work, you're not only making it better or more logical, you're stimulating his imagination. Like when you ask him, why did that character do that? He may have known, but he didn't make it clear in his work, the motivation. And emotion has to drive every piece, and a lot of times helping the writer discover what emotion it is driving the work. Like it took me a very long time to understand in my first novel, and this one, that the emotional engine driving the work was grief. And until you can name it and almost write that word and set it on top of your computer, the work has a hard time finding a focus. So that's what we do for each other as readers in my classes.
Do you think you came to the meaning because you wrote, or did you have it ahead of time and said to yourself, I'm going to write a novel about grief? Or in the very process of doing the writing, did you do the discovery?
Yes.
Yeah.
Always that first draft is a form of discovery. And I had a wonderful editor, Louis Rubin, who worked with me for 2 years on The Queen of October. And he is the one who helped me find my voice and the issues that I most care about. And he's the one who said, hey, look, kiddo, you're writing about divorce and grief, and you need to go ahead and put them together and get the job done.
How wonderful to have an editor who actually spends, what, 2 years with you?
I was very lucky, very fortunate, and he's
Yes.
a very wonderful editor, too, about the best you can have.
Well, we congratulate you on the 2 novels. We congratulate you on going into perhaps television and the movies. And we look forward to the next things that you're going to be doing. Thank you for joining us. With me today has been Shelley Mickle, and she is the author of Replacing Dad, and we are delighted that you joined us.